Moving on, this is a serious consideration. The amount of counterfeiting that goes on the world today, in the fashion world, in pharmaceuticals, in any variety of industries, the vendors we deal with, ideally, we have to have a total confidence in their respect for our patents, our trademarks, and our intellectual property. Altogether, too many companies will manufacture for offshore entities during the day legitimately and then engage in counterfeiting manufacturing at night. And the high-profile country is China, but it's not just China. It happens in lots of different places. So from a risk management perspective, to vet vendors from the viewpoint of patents, trademarks, intellectual property, etc., it's pretty important. That human rights piece, slave labor, forced labor, very important. In fact, here in the state of California, where we're broadcasting from at Cal State Long Beach, the state has a law called the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Came about in 2010. And any company that is headquartered in California or does business in California and has sales of more than $100 million a year has to publish on their website as part of the law, the California law, what specific measures they take to minimize the probability of human rights labor violations mostly with the vendors they deal with overseas. So if we know that, operating here in the state of California, obviously the ability to demonstrate human rights respect with our vendors is hugely important. It has to be part of your vendor selection process, as do green vendor initiatives. And then finally, KPIs, key performance indicators, some of which are quantitative, numbers oriented, maybe dollars or units based, but things like product quality, quantities, logistics, KPIs, on-time shipping being a good example, billing accuracy being another important KPI, meaning the bill from the vendor to us as the buyer. And how often do we as the buyer have to reject merchandise because of quality or other issues, or return goods to the vendor? We have to have KPIs, quantitative and qualitative, across the board. Some contractual clauses. When we actually negotiate with these vendors, what is it we need to be thinking about? What does our frame of reference have to look like? So we have a menu of items to be thinking of that, depending on our industry, depending on what we're trying to achieve with these vendors, we can address them and negotiate them ahead of time. Because the last time you want to be negotiating things is when goods are on the water or in the air or stuck in customs, and there's an issue that comes up that you didn't think about during the negotiation process. So this goes on as part of the sourcing strategy and considerations, purchasing strategy and considerations. Now we're moving into specific line item components of an overall agreement, contractual clauses. So product specs. We make smartphones, we buy smartphones, we buy tablets. They obviously have specifications, as do shoes, as does any product. Some more complex than others, but what are your specific product specs? What thickness of sole has to be on the shoe that we're buying from that vendor in Vietnam? That's an example of a product spec. The merchandise description. What is it that we're buying? This sounds overly simple. But if we don't get the right product description, merchandise description out from the very beginning, when we actually are moving goods and commercial invoices are being prepared with the product description on it, and it's not an adequate description, and it gets to customs and no one can figure out what that product is, you're going to have a customs delay based on something silly that could have been addressed way further up the supply chain. So don't underestimate the importance of clear, concise descriptions. Quality of goods. Certainly a huge issue in agriculture and food business. What grade, what quality of fish can I buy from a vendor in Japan? If I'm an almond exporter here in the United States, I would have the same considerations, albeit as the seller. What's the grade of quality of the product that I'm selling? Grade, size, and condition. Quantities and weights. Unit of measure. Is it dozens for socks? Is it units for compressors? Is the weight in pounds? Is it in kilos? What's the price? Unit price, currency of sale. Do we as buyers want to buy in dollars, or do we want to buy in renminbi out of China? Well, it's always nice to buy in your home currency because then you're not exposed to currency fluctuation. The problem is the vendors overseas, they want to sell in their currency to avoid the same problem. You have to negotiate that, but it has to be part of the negotiation. That's the point. Payment terms, not unusual at all in China to have a vendor accept a purchase order and say, I'll be needing 30% up front, 20% on the ship date, and the balance 30 days after shipment. That's fine as long as you know in advance that's what it is. Maybe you need a letter of credit as a buyer, or you don't need a letter of credit, but your vendor overseas would feel better if they had a site draft associated with the purchase. So a couple more on the contractual clause side of things. Depending on what it is we're buying, do we want warranties and returns policies from our vendors? How about substitution? The vendor can't sell us exactly what they wanted, but they have something that's kind of like what we wanted. That's substitution. Will we accept that? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. You have to negotiate it. What's the Incoterms 2010 rule, the shipping term? Ex works, free on board, delivered duty paid. You have to have that on the contractual clause side of things. Mode of transport. Will it be air freight? Will it be ocean freight? Will it be rail or truck in Europe or for NAFTA? What are our lead time agreements? Is it going to be 21 days on the water from Hong Kong to Charleston? That's what you need to agree upon. And what's the last ship date on a specific PO? Because if ship dates aren't respected or even specified, that is going to create a lead time offsetting issue that will ultimately blow up our entire MRP planning. You have to get that out there ahead of time as well. How about if we want to cancel an order? Our sales and operations planning activities have trickled down to an MRP environment. We're not selling as much of the finished product that we thought we would. We need to cancel orders with these vendors that we have all over the place in Myanmar, in Vietnam, in New Zealand. What's the cancellation date? What's the last cancellation date? What's the policy on chargebacks to our vendors? The vendor didn't do what they agreed to contractually. Do we charge them back for the expenses we incur? Customs delay being a good example of that. What kind of docs do we need? Commercial invoice, packing list, airway bill, bill of lading, certificate of origin, hazmat certificate. We don't know, but depending on what it is we're buying and who we're buying it from, we need to determine ahead of time what those docs are and how they need to look. Product description on a commercial invoice being a very good example of that. Should we have a dispute with our vendors overseas, how are we going to resolve that? Does it go to arbitration? Does it go to court in the United States? Does it go to court in Myanmar? You have to know. You don't want to be answering that question after the dispute arises. Applicable law. Does the law of California apply? Does the law of Taiwan apply? Again, you have to get it out there. And severability. We're not lawyers here, but severability means very quickly that if you have a contract with a vendor and one aspect of that one clause in that contract is deemed to be null and void, it's not applicable, everything else that's in the contract still stands. You have to have that, what's called a severability clause, in your contract. Make sure your legal people are involved as you go through this exercise.